He lived in a small, quiet town where people minded their own business. The kind of place where everyone waved from their porch but rarely stopped to talk for long. He liked it that way. After many years of living out of suitcases, sleeping in tents and military bases, he wanted nothing more than peace and silence. He'd moved into a small house on the edge of town, surrounded by tall trees that sang whenever the wind passed through. His house wasn't big or fancy, just a simple home with wooden floors, a worn couch, and a porch swing that creaked softly when he sat there at night. His only regular companion was a strong, calm dog named Shadow. The dog had dark fur, sharp eyes, and a loyalty that went deeper than words. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, he took Shadow for a walk through the neighborhood. He carried a cup of coffee in one hand and Shadow's leash in the other. The streets were empty at that hour, just the sound of birds waking up and the rhythm of his boots on the sidewalk. He liked those moments because they reminded him of something he missed: stillness. No one in town really knew who he was. He didn't talk much about his past. When people asked what he used to do for work, he'd just smile and say, "I used to travel a lot." Most assumed he'd been in some kind of government job or maybe security. He was polite, kept his yard tidy, helped the older folks shovel snow in the winter. The neighbors liked him but didn't know him. What no one knew was that he'd once been part of something few ever experience, an elite military unit known only to a handful of people in the world. He had trained in the harshest conditions, learned to survive anywhere, and carried out missions that never made the news. He was one of the best, but you'd never guess it by looking at him now. The war years had left him with quiet eyes. Not sad, but deep. He rarely raised his voice, rarely lost his temper. When something broke, he fixed it. When something hurt, he endured it. He didn't believe in showing pain. Shadow was the only one who truly understood him. Shadow wasn't just a pet. The dog had been with him through deployments and dangerous assignments. They'd been through firefights, storms, and long nights on foreign soil. Shadow had saved his life more than once. Now in this quiet little town, the two of them lived like old friends who had seen too much of the world and decided they'd had enough of it. Sometimes, the man sat on his porch and watched kids ride their bikes down the street. Their laughter carried through the air and he'd smile. Every now and then, one of the kids would wave and he'd raise a hand back. He didn't speak much, but his kindness showed in small ways: fixing a flat tire, returning a lost ball, giving advice when asked. People respected him, even if they didn't understand him. One afternoon, his next-door neighbor, a friendly woman who always wore bright scarves, brought him a pie. She said it was blueberry, from her own recipe. He thanked her, and when she asked if he lived alone, he nodded. "Just me and the dog," he said. "He's beautiful," she replied, glancing at Shadow. "He looks like he's trained." "He is," the man said softly. "He knows when to listen," she laughed. "Wish my husband did." He smiled, but behind that smile was something unspoken, the knowledge that Shadow was more than trained. He was a soldier's partner. That evening, after she left, he sat on the porch with a slice of pie and a cup of tea. Shadow lay beside him, head resting on his boots. Fireflies blinked in the yard, and somewhere far off a train horn echoed through the hills. For a moment, everything felt perfect. He'd finally found peace, or at least something close to it. But peace has a strange way of testing people. The next morning started like any other. He got up before sunrise, brewed coffee, and opened the back door. The air smelled like pine and wet soil. Shadow was already waiting, tail wagging. They set off down the familiar path through the neighborhood. As they passed the park, he nodded to an older man jogging by. Everyone in town recognized him by sight now, the quiet man with the big dog and the steady walk. But that morning, something felt different. He didn't notice it at first. The parked police cruiser a few streets away, the nervous eyes of a new neighbor watching from behind her curtains. She was new to town, hadn't met him yet. And when she saw a tall black man walking a muscular dog near her yard, she panicked. She didn't see the calm in his eyes or the gentle way Shadow stayed close to his leg. All she saw was what fear made her see. By the time he returned home, he noticed the faint sound of a radio somewhere down the street, and for a moment, Shadow's ears perked up. The dog sensed tension the way only trained animals could. The man reached down and patted his head. "Easy, boy," he said softly. "It's just another day." He didn't know that call had already been made. Back at home, he poured himself another cup of coffee and opened a small wooden box on his kitchen table. Inside were medals, some bright, some worn. A few had no markings at all. There were letters, too, from commanders and fellow soldiers. He picked up one letter, the corner creased from years of folding. It was from an old teammate who'd once said, "You've done more for this country than it'll ever know." He put the letter back, closed the box, and sighed. Shadow nuzzled his arm as if to remind him that life was still here, still moving. That afternoon, he went out to the small shop on Main Street to buy a new leash. The owner, an older man with white hair, greeted him warmly. "Hey, good to see you again. Shadow still behaving?" "Always," he replied. "Just need a stronger clip. The old one's wearing out." "You take good care of that dog," the owner said, wrapping the leash. "Most folks treat dogs like property. You treat him like a brother." The man smiled. He's earned it. When he walked back home, the town was bathed in golden sunlight. Children were playing with water guns. Someone was mowing their lawn. It was an ordinary day, so ordinary it almost made him forget the life he used to live. But sometimes, peace feels fragile like glass, beautiful but ready to crack at the slightest touch. That evening, as the sky turned orange, he sat on his porch again, reading an old paperback. Shadow lay nearby, half asleep. Every once in a while, the dog's ears twitched, catching some far-off sound only he could hear. The man looked out at the street. Cars passing, porch lights flicking on one by one. He felt content. After years of missions and chaos, he'd learned to love silence. But deep down, he also knew that silence never lasted forever. He remembered something one of his old commanders once told him. A soldier doesn't stop being a soldier just because the war is over. He just fights different battles. He didn't know what kind of battle was coming his way. Later that night, he cleaned Shadow's bowl, locked the doors, and turned off the porch light. The sound of crickets filled the air. As he lay in bed, the memories sometimes crept in. The sound of helicopters, the smell of sand, the voice of friends long gone. He tried not to think about it. Shadow's breathing beside him helped. The steady rhythm reminded him that life, no matter how painful, still had beauty left in it. In the middle of the night, a storm rolled in. Thunder shook the windows and Shadow growled softly before settling back down. The man turned over, half awake, and whispered, "It's okay. We're home now." He believed it when he said it. He had to. The next morning, the sun came out again, clear and bright as if nothing had happened. He made breakfast, eggs, toast, and a bit of bacon for Shadow. The dog wagged his tail happily, unaware that fate was quietly rearranging its pieces. When they went out for their walk, everything looked normal. But somewhere nearby, 2 police officers sat in their cruiser responding to a report. One of them yawned, the other checked his phone. They didn't know who they were about to meet. The man didn't know either. For now, it was still peace. Birds were singing. The street was quiet. Shadow trotted along beside him, proud and alert, every step in sync with his master's. He took the long route that morning, past the park and down the gravel road by the lake. He liked the reflection of the trees in the water, how calm everything seemed. He often thought that maybe, if he stayed here long enough, he could forget the world he came from, a world full of noise, orders, and loss. Sometimes he wondered if peace was something you found or something you built, one quiet day at a time. He didn't know the answer yet. But as he threw a stick for Shadow to chase, watching the dog leap into the water with joy, he smiled for real. Not the polite smile he gave neighbors, but the kind that came from somewhere deep inside. For that one moment, everything was right. He didn't know that peace was about to be tested, that by tomorrow, the quiet town would no longer be so quiet. For now, there was just a man, his dog, and a morning that felt like forever. The morning sun was bright, the kind that made everything look softer than it really was. The man finished his coffee, clipped Shadow's leash, and stepped outside. The air smelled fresh after the storm that had passed the night before. Water still dripped from the leaves, and the street glistened as though the world had just been washed clean. He liked mornings like this. They made him forget for a little while about everything that used to haunt him. The town was still quiet, and that silence always gave him peace. He didn't know that just a few blocks away, 2 police officers were sitting in their car, parked near the corner. They were new to the area, still learning the faces and rhythms of the town. They didn't know the quiet man who walked his dog every morning. They didn't know he had lived there for years, helping neighbors and keeping to himself. The call had come in only 15 minutes earlier. A nervous voice on the line had said something about a large dog off leash and a suspicious man walking around the neighborhood. It wasn't a serious call, just one of those routine checks they got every week. But the dispatcher had to send someone. The officers didn't mean any harm. They were just doing what they were told. But sometimes doing what you're told isn't the same as doing what's right. The man walked down the familiar path toward the park, Shadow trotting calmly beside him. Every few steps, Shadow looked up as if checking to make sure everything was fine. He always did that. It was part of his nature, protective, alert, gentle in his own way. As they reached the corner near the park, the man noticed a car parked on the other side of the street. It looked like a patrol car, though he didn't think much of it at first. Police sometimes passed through and he had nothing to hide. He nodded politely as they drove a few feet closer. Shadow wagged his tail once, curious. The officer in the passenger seat lowered his window slightly and said, "Morning, sir." "Morning," the man replied, his tone calm, friendly even. "Everything okay here?" the officer asked. "Everything's fine," the man said, tightening his grip on Shadow's leash just a little. "Just taking my dog for a walk." The officers glanced at each other. They had heard the report mention something about a large, aggressive dog, but the animal standing before them didn't look aggressive. The man didn't look threatening either. Still, the situation made them cautious. The second officer stepped out of the car, keeping his hand near his belt, not in a threatening way, just out of habit. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, still new to the job. He'd been told to stay alert, and he took that advice seriously. "Sir, can I see some ID?" he asked. The man blinked, surprised. "ID? I'm just walking my dog." "It's just procedure," the officer said quickly. "We got a call, that's all." The man sighed softly, trying to stay patient. He understood how these things worked. "All right," he said, reaching slowly into his back pocket. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Shadow stood perfectly still beside him, his tail low, eyes fixed on the younger officer. The dog sensed tension. While one officer checked the ID, the other glanced around, scanning the area. Nothing seemed wrong. A jogger passed by, nodding politely. The street was calm. Birds were chirping. The officer handed the ID back. "Thank you, sir." "You live around here?" "Just down the street," the man replied. "I've been here a few years." "Okay," the officer said, looking unsure. He wanted to leave it at that, but curiosity got the better of him. "That's a strong-looking dog. What kind is he?" "Belgian Malinois," the man said. "He's trained. Used to work with me." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Work?" "Military," the man said simply. Long time ago, there was a pause. The officers didn't quite know how to respond. They nodded awkwardly, trying to sound casual. "Well, he's a fine animal," one of them said. "Thank you," the man replied. It should have ended there. It almost did, but sometimes fate has a strange way of turning ordinary moments into something bigger. A car door slammed somewhere down the street. The sound startled a small dog nearby, which began barking loudly. Shadow's ears perked up. He gave a short bark back, alert but not aggressive. The young officer flinched slightly. "Easy," the man said to Shadow, keeping his voice low and steady. Shadow stopped barking right away, sitting down at his master's feet. But the officer, already tense, had misread the movement. He thought the dog was about to lunge. "Sir, can you control your dog, please?" the officer said sharply. "I am," the man replied calmly. "He's not going anywhere." The older officer, sensing the tension rising, spoke quietly. "It's fine. Let's just wrap this up." But before they could, the radio crackled. A dispatcher's voice said something about, "Stay on scene until further notice." The young officer frowned, uncertain. "We're being told to stay." The man took a slow breath. "Look, officers, I've done nothing wrong. I'm just trying to take my dog for a walk." "You've seen my ID. You can go ahead and verify it." The older officer nodded. "Of course, sir. Give us a moment." He stepped aside to speak softly into the radio. The man waited, calm but cautious. He'd dealt with tense situations before, far worse ones. But something about this felt strange. The way the officers kept glancing at each other, the unease in their posture. It reminded him of how young soldiers looked on their first mission. He didn't want trouble. He just wanted to go home. While they waited, a couple walking their baby stroller slowed down, watching the scene from across the street. One of them whispered something. The man heard it faintly, words like police and trouble. He kept his eyes on Shadow, rubbing the dog's neck gently to keep him relaxed. After a moment, the older officer came back. His expression had changed, less guarded, almost respectful. "Everything checks out," he said. "Sorry about the inconvenience, sir." "Just standard follow-up." The man nodded. "No problem." But before he could walk away, the younger officer added, "You know, sir, if you could maybe walk your dog a bit earlier or keep him closer to home, it might keep people from getting nervous." The man looked at him for a long moment. "People get nervous about things they don't understand," he said quietly. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean—" "It's all right," the man said, cutting him off gently. "You were doing your job." He turned and started walking home, Shadow beside him, head held high. The officers watched him go. The older one said softly, "He's not what I expected." The younger one nodded. "Yeah, he's different." When the man reached his gate, he paused. He could still feel their eyes on him, but he didn't turn around. Instead, he knelt down and patted Shadow's head. "You did good," he said softly. Shadow wagged his tail, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. But the peace didn't last long. Later that afternoon, as he sat on his porch, his neighbor from across the street came over, looking worried. "I heard what happened this morning," she said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he replied. "Just a misunderstanding," she sighed. "This town's usually quiet. People get jumpy when they see something unfamiliar." "I know," he said. "That's how fear works." She hesitated, then added, "I told them you're one of the kindest people here." "You helped fix my fence last month," he smiled faintly. "That was just a few nails and some wood." "Still," she said, "people notice kindness, even when they pretend not to." After she left, he sat quietly, watching the sky change colors as the sun began to set. Shadow rested beside him, head on his paws, eyes half closed. He thought about what had happened, how quickly calm could turn into tension. He didn't blame the officers, not entirely. The world had made everyone nervous. Fear spread faster than truth these days. He had seen fear destroy good people before on both sides of battlefields. He knew what it could do if left unchecked. That's why he always tried to stay calm, to show control even when things got complicated. The next few days passed quietly. But the story of the man with the big dog spread through the neighborhood. Some people stopped to say hello when he walked by just to show they weren't afraid. Others avoided eye contact. It didn't bother him much. He'd learned long ago that respect takes time, and fear fades only when people see who you really are. One afternoon, he saw the same two officers again, this time parked near the grocery store. The older one recognized him and nodded. The man nodded back. There was no hostility between them now, just quiet understanding. Still, something about the young officer's expression made him pause. It wasn't anger exactly, more like regret. The man almost went over to speak with him, but decided against it. Some things take time to settle. When he got home, he poured a glass of water, sat on his porch, and watched Shadow chase a butterfly across the yard. The simple sight made him smile. He thought about all the times he'd been in places where peace felt impossible. Yet here in this small town, he'd found something that came close. He wasn't going to let one misunderstanding take that away from him. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Shadow returned to his side, panting happily, tail thumping against the floor. The man reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You and me, buddy," he said quietly. "We'll be all right." Shadow looked up at him as if he understood every word. For now, the world was calm again. But deep down, the man knew that calm never lasted forever. He had learned that lesson long ago. Still, he chose to believe in the quiet, to hold on to it for as long as he could. Because peace, he'd learned, wasn't something you found once. It was something you had to keep choosing every single day. Days passed quietly after that strange morning. The man kept to his usual routine. Early walks, coffee on the porch, evenings spent fixing things around the house. To anyone watching, life looked normal again. But beneath that calm surface, something had changed. He felt it every time he stepped outside. The looks were different now. Some neighbors smiled kindly. Others turned away a bit too quickly. Word had spread, and though no one meant harm, whispers had their own way of lingering. He didn't blame anyone. Small towns thrived on stories, People talked because they needed something to talk about. Still, it hurt a little, not because he cared about what people thought, but because he had worked hard to become invisible, to live quietly after years of noise. The last thing he wanted was attention. Shadow didn't notice any of this. The dog stayed cheerful, ready for every walk, every stick thrown, every pat on the head. Sometimes, when the man's thoughts grew heavy, Shadow would rest his head on his leg as if to remind him that the world was still simple when seen through a dog's eyes. One morning, while fixing a loose board on the porch, the man noticed the sound of gravel crunching. A car was slowing down in front of his house. When he looked up, he saw one of the police officers from that morning, the older one. The man didn't move. He waited. The officer stepped out holding a paper bag. "Brought you something," he said with an awkward smile. The man frowned slightly but stayed polite. "You didn't have to." "It's just coffee," the officer said, setting the bag on the porch railing. "My wife runs the diner on Main Street. She said you like it black." The man nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." The officer hesitated, then added, "I wanted to say, I'm sorry about that morning. It shouldn't have gone that way." The man looked at him for a long moment before replying, "You were doing your job. I understand that." "Still," the officer said, rubbing the back of his neck, "it didn't feel right. You were calm, respectful, and we made it harder than it needed to be." The man gave a faint smile. "You learn with time that people act on what they know. Sometimes that's not much." The officer nodded. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" The man didn't answer right away. He just looked out toward the trees. "Enough," he said finally. They stood there in silence for a moment. Then the officer said, "If you ever need anything, call me." He took a small card from his pocket and set it next to the coffee bag. The man nodded, thanked him, and watched as he drove away. After he left, the man sat back down on the porch, the paper cup warm in his hands. He wasn't angry. In fact, he felt a strange sense of peace. The world had a way of testing people, and maybe this was its way of testing him again. Not through battle, but through patience. Later that day, he walked into town to buy some groceries. People greeted him politely, though some did so with a kind of careful distance. At the counter, the shop owner smiled and said, "Heard you had a visit from our boys in blue." "Just a misunderstanding," the man said simply. The shop owner nodded. "Well, you handled it better than most would have. My brother would have lost his temper." "Doesn't solve anything," the man replied. As he left the store, an older man sitting on a bench called out, "Hey, you the one with the big dog?" He smiled. "That's me. He's a fine-looking animal. Smart, too. Saw you training him by the lake once. He listens better than most people." The man chuckled. "He's been through a lot. Knows when to listen." The older man nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "You got that soldier's way about you," he said. "Steady. Don't say much, but always paying attention." The man froze for just a second, then smiled politely. "Just an old habit, I guess." He walked home quietly, thinking about that comment. He'd spent years trying to let go of that part of himself, the part that always watched, always prepared. But no matter how much time passed, it was still there. He could feel it in the way he noticed small sounds, small changes in people's tone, the way shadows moved when the wind changed. It wasn't paranoia. It was training. That evening, while feeding Shadow, he thought about what the officer had said. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" It was a simple question, but it carried weight. He had seen things most people never would, places where trust and courage were all you had. He'd lost friends, saved strangers, and made decisions that haunted him even now. But he'd done it for the right reasons, and maybe that was why he'd chosen this quiet life, to balance the scales somehow. A few days later, something unusual happened. A letter arrived in his mailbox with no return address. It was neatly typed, short and direct. It said, "We heard about the incident. Just checking in. Proud of you for keeping calm. You taught us that once." There was no signature, but he didn't need one. He knew exactly who it was from. One of his old teammates, someone who still kept tabs on him from time to time. He smiled faintly and tucked the letter into the wooden box where he kept his old medals. It was strange how the past never truly stayed buried. That weekend, he went back to the park with Shadow. It was late afternoon and the golden light stretched across the grass. A few kids were playing soccer. Some parents sat nearby on benches. Everything looked peaceful again. As he threw a stick for Shadow to fetch, one of the kids ran over and asked, "Mister, can I pet your dog?" "Sure," he said. "Just let him sniff your hand first." The boy did as told, and Shadow wagged his tail. "He's so well behaved," the boy said. "He's had a lot of training," the man replied with a small smile. "Did you train him?" "Yes, a long time ago." The boy looked curious. "Was he a police dog?" "Something like that," the man said gently. The boy smiled and ran back to his friends. The man watched them for a while, remembering when life had felt that simple. Before orders, before loss, before the world became complicated. That night, he sat outside with a notebook. It had been years since he'd written anything, but he found himself scribbling down thoughts, not about war or missions, but about peace. About what it meant to live after the noise had ended. He wrote, "Peace isn't the absence of noise. It's the decision to stay calm even when noise returns." As he looked at those words, he realized how far he'd come. He wasn't the same man he'd been before. He'd learned to choose quiet even when the world pushed him toward anger. The next morning, he saw the younger officer from before walking up his driveway. He looked nervous, like someone about to confess something. "Morning," the man said evenly. "Morning, sir," the officer replied. "Do you have a minute?" "Sure." The officer took a deep breath. "I just wanted to say I've been thinking about that morning. I realize I misread the situation. I was too cautious. I let fear take the lead." The man nodded, saying nothing. "I also found out more about you," the officer continued softly. "The department ran your ID through the veteran registry. I hope you don't mind." The man stayed quiet. "They said you served in a special operations unit. I didn't know. I'm sorry I treated you like a suspect." The man finally spoke. "Son, respect doesn't come from knowing someone's past. It comes from how you treat them in the present." The officer nodded, eyes down. "You're right. I just wanted you to know that I'm learning. That I'll do better." "I believe you will," the man said. For a moment, the officer looked relieved. Then he smiled faintly. "Your dog's something else. I've never seen one so calm under pressure." The man smiled too. "He's been through worse." When the officer left, the man stood on his porch for a long while, watching Shadow lying peacefully by the steps. He realized something. Forgiveness was its own kind of strength. Over the next few weeks, things slowly returned to normal. The neighbors began talking to him again, more warmly this time. The two officers often waved when they drove by. Even the woman who had made the original call once stopped by to apologize. She brought cookies, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said. "I just got scared." "It's all right," the man told her gently. "Fear makes people do things they don't mean." She smiled with watery eyes. "You're very kind." He simply nodded. Later that evening, as he sat outside with Shadow, he looked up at the stars. The air was cool and the night was quiet. He thought about everything that had happened, how quickly peace could be shaken, and how easily people could misunderstand each other. But he also thought about how things had settled, how people had learned and grown from it. Maybe that was the point. Maybe life wasn't about avoiding trouble, but about finding calm after it passed. He looked down at Shadow, who was half asleep beside him. "You know," he said softly, "we might just be all right after all." The dog's tail thumped once against the wooden floor. The man leaned back and closed his eyes, listening to the crickets, feeling the world slow down. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now there was peace. The kind he had spent a lifetime searching for, and this time, he wasn't going to let go of it easily. The town had started to change. People who once kept their distance now waved when they saw him walking down the street. The same neighbors who used to whisper now smiled and greeted him with warmth. It was small things at first. A nod at the grocery store, a cup of coffee paid for by someone anonymous, a kind word at the post office. Slowly, quietly, the town was beginning to see him not as a stranger, but as one of their own. He noticed it one morning while buying bread at the bakery. The woman behind the counter, who used to speak to him only in short, polite sentences, smiled and said, "Your dog's famous now. Everyone's talking about how well-behaved he is." He chuckled softly. "He's had a lot of practice." "You must have trained him well," she said. "Takes patience to do that," he nodded. "Patience and trust." When he walked back home, the sunlight fell gently across the street. Kids were riding bikes, someone was mowing their lawn, and a man was washing his car. It was all so ordinary, But to him, that ordinariness was beautiful. It meant peace was finally real, but peace never stays untouched for long. That afternoon, a car pulled up in front of his house. He recognized the license plate. It wasn't from the town. When the door opened, two men stepped out. They weren't in uniform, but he could tell immediately who they were. He didn't panic. He just stood quietly on the porch and waited. One of them smiled. "Been a long time?" "It has," the man replied. The visitor looked around. "Nice place you got here, quiet." That's the idea. The men introduced themselves as representatives from an agency he once worked with. They had come not for orders, but out of respect. Word of the small-town incident had somehow reached higher circles and people had started asking questions. Not about the event itself, but about him. "We just wanted to check in," one of them said. "You're kind of a legend in some circles. People still tell stories about the missions you led." "I don't live that life anymore," the man said quietly. "We know," the other replied, "but it's good to see you're doing all right. Some of us worry about what happens to men like you after everything ends." He nodded, appreciating the honesty. "You learn to live slow," he said. "That's the hardest mission of all." They stayed for a short while, drinking coffee on his porch and talking about old times. Nothing specific, just memories of long nights, cold places, and faces they still remembered. Before leaving, one of the men said, "You should know. The story about that morning is being used as a case study. Training material. About patience and restraint. About how things could have gone wrong but didn't." The man smiled faintly. "If that helps someone learn, then it's worth it." When they left, he watched their car disappear down the road and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Closure. For once, his past hadn't come back to haunt him. It had come back to honor him. That night, he sat outside with Shadow watching the stars. The dog rested his head on his lap, content. The air was cool, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew. He thought about everything. The misunderstanding, the people, the lessons hidden in small moments. He realized that peace wasn't something that happened by chance. It was something people built together, choice by choice. The next morning, he was surprised to see a small group of people gathered near the park. There were tables, chairs, and a banner that said Community Safety Day. The police department had organized it, inviting families, veterans, and dog owners to learn about cooperation and communication. The older officer spotted him walking by and waved. "Hey, glad you could make it." "I didn't know there was an event," the man said. "It's something we started after what happened," the officer replied, trying to bridge gaps. "Thought maybe you could stop by, meet some folks." The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right." He didn't like being the center of attention, but as he stood there, people began greeting him warmly. Some thanked him for how calmly he handled the situation that day. Others asked about Shadow, wanting to know how to train their own dogs. He spent the afternoon talking to people, not about his past, but about patience, communication, and trust. He spoke simply with the kind of wisdom that doesn't need fancy words. He told them how fear often starts with misunderstanding and how small moments of kindness can change everything. The crowd listened. Some took notes. A few even applauded. The police chief, who had heard about his background, walked up and shook his hand. "You've done more for this town than you know," he said. "I didn't do much," the man replied. "Just stayed calm." "That's more than most people can do," the chief said. "We've started something new because of you. A training program called the Shadow Protocol. It teaches officers to pause, assess, and communicate before reacting. Named it after your dog." The man's eyes softened. "That's kind of you." "He deserves it," the chief said. "You both do." For a moment, the man didn't speak. He just looked down at Shadow, who was sitting proudly beside him, tail wagging. He reached down and patted the dog's head. Later that evening, after the event ended, people lingered to talk. One of the young officers, the same one who had once been so tense, came over and said, "You changed the way I see things. I used to think authority was about control. Now I realize it's about calm." The man smiled. "That's a good lesson to learn early." "It took a while," the officer said with a grin, "but I'll remember it." When the crowd finally dispersed, the man and Shadow walked home together under the setting sun. He felt lighter than he had in years. Not because the world had changed, but because he'd seen people trying, really trying, to do better. When he got home, He took the old wooden box from the shelf and opened it again. Inside, beside his medals, he placed the small pamphlet from the event. On the cover were the words, "The Shadow Protocol, Building Understanding Through Patience." He closed the box gently and whispered, "We did all right, didn't we?" Shadow wagged his tail as if agreeing. Over the next few weeks, he started seeing real changes in the town. Officers would stop to greet residents during their patrols. People from different backgrounds began chatting more at the local cafe. The park felt more alive than ever. Sometimes, when he passed by, he'd see new officers running drills with their service dogs, learning calm commands instead of aggressive ones. Each time they'd wave at him and say, "Morning, sir," he'd nod, humble as always. One day, the town invited him to speak at the school. The children had written essays about courage and respect, and their teacher wanted them to meet someone who embodied both. He wasn't sure at first, but he agreed. Standing in front of the class, he looked at their eager faces and said, "Courage isn't about being the strongest or loudest. It's about staying kind when you could be angry. It's about understanding before judging." The kids listened closely, and one of them raised a hand. "Mister, what do you do when people treat you unfairly?" He smiled softly. "You stay calm. Because anger can win a moment, but calm wins a life." When the session ended, the children gathered around to pet Shadow, who wagged his tail patiently. Their laughter filled the room, and the man felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the kind that came from medals or missions, but the kind that came from seeing hope pass from one generation to the next. That night, as he sat on the porch, the same neighbor who had once brought him pie walked over again. She handed him an envelope. "They're holding a small ceremony next week," she said. "At the park. You might want to be there." He opened the envelope after she left. Inside was an invitation. It said Community Recognition Event, Honoring Acts of Calm Courage. He smiled and set it aside. He didn't need recognition, but he appreciated the gesture. The following week, the entire town gathered at the park. The police chief gave a short speech about how one moment of patience had changed their way of thinking. Then he called the man forward. He walked slowly to the front, Shadow at his side. The crowd clapped. Not the loud kind of applause that comes from fame, but the warm kind that comes from respect. The chief handed him a small plaque. It read, "For reminding us that calm is stronger than fear." The man accepted it quietly and said, "Peace is built one choice at a time. I just made mine. Now it's up to everyone else to make theirs." When he sat back down, people came over to shake his hand. Children wanted to take pictures with Shadow. Families thanked him for showing the town a different way to see one another. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he walked home feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. He stood on his porch, looking out at the street where everything had begun. The same road, the same trees, the same quiet air, but it all felt different now. It felt like home, not just a hiding place. He knelt down beside Shadow and whispered, "We found it, didn't we? Real peace." The dog's tail thumped softly. He smiled, looking up at the fading light. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that no matter what came next, he had finally made peace with the past and with himself, and in that simple, quiet moment, surrounded by nothing but stillness, he realized that sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about war or victory. They're about calm. They're about people choosing understanding when the world expects anger. For him, that was the only kind of victory that mattered. The seasons began to change again, and the little town started to look different under the touch of autumn. Leaves turned gold. The air grew crisp, and the days felt slower in a comforting way. Life had found its rhythm again. He kept to his quiet routine: morning walks with Shadow, coffee on the porch, small talks with neighbors. Yet something deep inside him had shifted. The world outside hadn't changed much, but his way of seeing it had. Every sound, every breeze, every familiar face felt more alive now. After the community ceremony, people treated him like family. The same police officers who once looked uneasy around him now stopped by to chat. Some even brought their own dogs for Shadow to meet. The park had become a place of learning and connection. Children laughed freely there, and the tension that once lived in the air had dissolved. One morning, he received a letter from the local high school. They were organizing a new mentorship program for students who wanted to serve their communities, not just in the military or police, but through kindness, leadership, and self-discipline. They wanted him to help guide the first group. He hesitated at first. Teaching was never something he planned to do. But then he thought about all the lessons life had taught him. Lessons written not in books but in silence, patience, and compassion. Maybe those lessons were worth sharing. The following week, he walked into the school auditorium. The room was filled with students, notebooks open, faces eager. The teacher introduced him simply as a man who knows what it means to stay calm when the world feels loud. He smiled a little at that. When he started speaking, he didn't use big words. He told stories, small ones about trust, teamwork, and what it means to take responsibility for your actions. He spoke about the importance of seeing people, really seeing them before reacting. At first, the students were quiet, but soon hands started to rise. One asked, "How do you stay calm when someone misunderstands you?" He answered softly, "You remember that their fear is not always about you. Sometimes it's about something they don't understand yet." Another student asked, "Do you ever feel angry?" He thought for a moment. Of course, everyone does. But anger is like a fire. It can warm or destroy depending on how you use it. I try to use mine to light understanding. When the session ended, the teacher thanked him and said, "You've given them something rare, the idea that strength can be quiet." He nodded, humbly. "Quiet strength lasts longer," he said. After that day, he returned often, sometimes just to listen, other times to guide. The students grew to admire him not as a hero, but as someone who understood what peace meant. Back at home, life remained simple. He would sit on the porch with Shadow, sipping tea and watching the sunset stretch across the sky. The dog, now a little older, would rest at his feet, peaceful and loyal as ever. Every few days he received letters from people across the state, officers who had heard about the Shadow Protocol. They thanked him for inspiring change, for reminding them to pause, to think, to see. One officer wrote, "Your story made me rethink how I see people on the street. It made me a better human first, then a better officer." He would read those letters slowly, each word like a quiet echo of something larger than himself. He never replied with long answers, only a few lines. "Stay patient, stay kind. The world listens when you do." Months passed like that, peaceful and full of small meaning. Then one day, the mayor visited his home. She wanted to name a part of the park after him and Shadow, not for fame, but to remind people of what calm courage could do. He smiled at the idea. "I don't need my name on a sign," he said. "It's not about fame," she replied. "It's about what you stood for." He thought about it quietly. "Then make it about understanding, not me," he said. "Call it the circle of calm. Let it remind people that peace starts in moments like this, in small, ordinary ones." The mayor smiled. "We'll do that," and they did. A few weeks later, a new plaque appeared in the park. It read, "The Circle of Calm, dedicated to those who choose peace over pride and patience over fear." People would walk by and pause to read it. Some didn't know the full story behind it, but they felt its meaning. On a bright Saturday morning, he was invited to speak at the park again. It was the first official Shadow Day, celebrating service animals and community cooperation. Families gathered with their dogs. Children ran around and laughter filled the air. He stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching. The police chief spotted him and called him to the small stage. When he walked up, the crowd fell silent, waiting for his words. He looked around at the faces, young, old, hopeful, learning. He spoke slowly with warmth in his voice. "There was a time when I believed peace was something given to us," he said. "But I learned it's something we build, one act, one word, one moment at a time. It doesn't start with big speeches. It starts with how we treat each other every day." He paused, looking at the crowd. "You don't have to wear a uniform to serve. You just have to care. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is listen." The crowd applauded softly, and some people even wiped their eyes. Afterward, he stayed to talk with families. A little boy ran up and said, "Mister, I want to be calm like you when I grow up." He smiled, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. "Then you're already on the right path." The day went on with music, games, and laughter. Shadow was the star, sitting proudly as children petted him and took pictures. When evening came and the last of the people began to leave, the man stood under the oak tree near the plaque. The golden light filtered through the branches, casting long shadows over the grass. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace that ran deeper than words. He remembered the journey, the quiet life, the misunderstanding, the lessons learned. It all felt distant now, like a storm that had passed, leaving the air clear and clean. The world had changed around him. Yes, but more importantly, it had changed through him. In the weeks that followed, he continued his calm routine. Sometimes visitors from other towns came to learn about the program. He would sit with them under the oak tree and share the same simple truth. Peace isn't an accident. It's a choice. People listened and they carried that message home. Slowly, other towns began adopting similar programs. Small acts of understanding began spreading, a quiet ripple that touched far beyond that little community. Then, one morning, as winter settled in, he woke up to find the first snow falling gently outside. Shadow bounded through the snow, leaving prints across the yard. The sight made him smile, a simple, pure kind of joy. He spent that day sitting by the window, watching the world turn white. It felt like a clean page, a new chapter written in silence. Later that evening, he took out the old wooden box again. Inside were his medals, the plaque, a few letters from the students, and a small folded piece of paper. He opened it. It was the first thank you note he'd ever received from one of the officers. The words were faded but still clear. "You reminded me to see before I judge." He smiled softly and placed it back. Then he added something new, a small photograph from Shadow Day, showing children laughing beside the oak tree. He closed the box, knowing it held not just his past, but the proof that his life had meant something good. As the night grew quiet, he stepped outside one last time. The air was cold but peaceful. The stars were bright and the town lights glowed softly in the distance. He looked out across the park, at the place that had seen misunderstanding turn into unity, fear into trust, and silence into calm. He whispered to the night, "We did what we came here to do." Shadow leaned gently against his leg, warm and steady. Together they stood there for a while, man and dog, side by side under the open sky. There were no crowds, no cameras, no noise, just peace, and in that moment it was enough.